Hello, this is episode 17 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, author of the book The Principles of Unarmed Combat, and I tell stories about martial arts. One note before we get to our guest today: if you're listening to this show and you enjoy it, please click the subscribe button down below, as it does help the show. Our guest today is one of the world's leading experts in how to employ hand-to-hand combat in real-world life and death situations. Greg Thompson is the creator of the Special Operations Combatives Program, or SOCP, which is the primary hand-to-hand combat training method used by the U.S. Army Special Forces. He's the lead civilian trainer for the Special Forces, as well as other military and federal law enforcement entities, including elite special missions units, which we cannot talk about due to Greg's NDAs, but he trained some of the deadliest professional warriors on the planet, and I'm happy to welcome him to the show. Greg, how are you?
Wonderful. And yourself?
I'm doing good. Thank you for taking the time to come on today. I appreciate it, man.
No, glad to be here.
Now, when I say you train some of these elite units, I know a lot of people in the martial arts world make these claims that, oh, I train the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs. But in actuality, what it is that they usually train one guy who used to be a Green Beret, or maybe they once did a single seminar for a group of these guys. But you were actually the main person running combatives training for several of these special operations units and have been doing this for like 20 years now, right?
Well, I started working with special operations units in '98, so I guess approaching 27 years.
Yeah.
It's pretty much been
Yeah.
my career from '98 on, and yeah, you often see that where people make these claims. I don't even pay it any attention. It doesn't bother me at all. But you'll see a guy may have somebody in their class, and then now all of a sudden they're training this whole
Yeah.
unit,
Yeah.
or they actually may have came in to work with a team that's a part of a unit, but it doesn't mean they're training all their units. So
Right.
if you say, hey, this SF group brought you in, but it's a small team brought you in because you're a
Yeah.
buddy of a buddy recommended it, and they were there for 3 days, and then now they're training all these people, and it's
Yeah. And I,
you
I
know
just I wanted to make that clear that you are the man for this. People who have been in special operations units, who have been in the special forces, they know who you are because you are the official person that the military uses. Your SOCP program is the official program that is used by a lot of these units, right?
yeah. Well, I'm
Okay.
blessed to be there. I was fortunate to start, working with a specialty unit out of Fort Bragg, in '98, and
Mhm.
then it kind of guided me from being a martial artist, jujitsu, MMA practitioner, to thinking about DT and combatives and kind of the
Yeah.
difference
So
between the two.
to backtrack a second, can you tell people how you got into all this? I know you started with a bit of high school wrestling, and I think you did a little taekwondo as a kid, right? And then when the
Yeah,
first
yeah,
UFCs hit, you saw Hoist Gracie and his jujitsu and got interested in training in that.
yeah. Well, like so many kids, I was born in '68,
Mm.
so the time I came up as a youth, I think I started my first traditional martial arts. I was probably 8 or 9 at the time, and it was that was all that was there. So you would do these, and there were some real tough traditional martial artists that focused more on fighting skill sets, but more often than not across the country, it was you'd learn a kata and you'd learn this different things, and you'd do a little bit of sparring, but it was not preparing me the way I wanted to, but I liked it. And I kind of knew in my mind that as a kid, because I'd get in playground fights and I would do different stuff than what I would do in the classroom. And then what you would see on TV as a
Yeah.
kid back then was, you just wonder, well, maybe I just can't figure this out. Or then
Yeah.
I started realizing later on, that there was this big gap. you know.
Yeah, you have a very similar trajectory to me. I think everybody back then, 70s, early 80s, you started in the traditional martial arts because that's what you saw in pop culture, and you figured, oh, Bruce Lee and Kwai Chang Caine, and that's how you can beat up 100 guys, and then you find out there's some other stuff out there, boxing and kickboxing and wrestling that work in some cases better than the traditional martial arts stuff. So I think we both sort of realized that early on and started gravitating towards
Yeah,
more
yeah. And so
combat
that was kind of
sports.
my thing. And then there wasn't a youth program until junior high. So in junior high school, I started wrestling. And I remember my Taekwondo instructor was like, "Well, why do you want to wrestle?" And I'm like, "Well, I just like it." And he's like, "Well, the bigger guy's gonna take you down and beat you up." And I'm just like, "Hey, I just want to wrestle." But it was just kind of in my nature to like to clinch
Yeah.
anyway, and just I don't know, I just gravitated to it. So I did wrestling in junior high and high school, but football became my main focus,
Hmm.
because nobody was showing up to wrestling matches. Maybe a couple moms in the stands back then. And football in the Carolinas, that was how you made your mark. I did pretty good in high school. Then I went to college football at Western Carolina University for my undergrad. And that was good for a while, but I realized there was only so far I could go doing that.
Hmm.
And did it for a little bit and still kept up with some of my striking back then. And I went to got accepted to the School of Design at NC State for a 3-year graduate program for industrial design, which is
Hmm.
like basically an inventor's degree, product design,
Right.
and product development. While I was there, I started doing some Thai boxing, and that really completed me. Learned because my Thai boxing coach was a pro boxer who added a lot of kicks, so it really completed some of my traditional striking arts. And then watched the first UFC in '93, and then I was like, man, that's the missing link. If that little
Yeah,
guy
yeah.
can do that, and that's the same thing with everybody. I'm kind of repeating what everybody kind of knew and said a lot without.
Well, not everybody recognized it back then.
Yeah, well, they do now, but back
Yeah.
then they did. Nobody was still getting it. That was so awesome about it. I started, training, buying the cassettes back then to see the in action tape, and then I think
Hmm.
they had the Gracie Basics came out, and you were doing Americana, and you're like thought it was the greatest thing ever, and you
Yeah, I know you started in actually training with people, some of the soldiers down in Fort Bragg. How did you find out these guys were training there? Did you just call up the Gracie Academy in California and ask where there was a school near you?
there was a couple buddies of mine, and one of them owned a gym, a weightlifting gym, and he was friends. A buddy of his that raised pit bulls had a friend, and his son was Norm Hooten,
Uh,
and then he was already training with the Gracies prior to the first UFC. So the Gracie family was going to Fort Bragg working with the unit out there,
right,
by way of Norm Hooten and Paul
right.
Hines. And
Right.
then he
And
invited
for people who aren't familiar with that name, if anyone has ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down, the soldier named Hoot in it, played by Eric Banya, that character was based on Norm Hooten. So those were pretty serious guys for you to start training with. Did you have any idea at the time who they were or what they did in the military?
no, no,
No.
no, no idea. Um, I was invited to do some training with him, or actually we invited him down, and he was a white belt at the time, and I probably had 20 pounds on him and a lot more wrestling. And I remember rolling around with him, and after about 10 minutes, he caught me in a straight arm lock, and then I just smiled. I was like, finally, you know, this
Ex
this he's a physical stud now.
yeah.
But I set some school records for powerlifting. I was a 405 record at Western Carolina, and I was 200 pounds. And
Yeah. You know when a guy that's so much
physical.
smaller than you is tapping you, you're saying, yeah, this stuff works. This is
Oh
something
yeah,
good.
I just like the physical contact. But when I got caught and I was barely missing some things, and he was wearing a white belt, I'm like, this is the way to go.
Yeah. Uh,
Um,
And he and some of these other guys, they sort of took you under their wing. They brought you out with them on training visits to the Gracie Academy in California, right?
I was
What,
invited on some trips out there when Norm
what,
went.
what was the training like out there back in those days?
But it was really good. I mean, we always had striking in, not always, but a lot of the training sessions was dealing with someone open hand striking you from
Hmm.
the
Right.
guard, and then achieving the clinch. So, got somebody to have gloves on, and you would have to achieve the clinch while they were striking at you.
Hmm.
And that was there, and there was weapons in the some handguns, and there so you have to learn some self defense.
Right.
But it was different than the sport aspect of right now, which I'm not opposed to the sportive aspect as long as someone knows what they're giving up. You
Yeah.
know,
And you actually became one of the first people that Hoist Gracie ever promoted to black belt, right?
Hoist gave out his first 5 black belts to me and 4 other guys at my gym in 2004.
That's something to have the UFC one champion promote you to black belt.
It
That's
was
pretty
something.
good.
I mean, it was, and I can't say that I was, you know, us 5 were the top tier guys that they had. What kind of evolved into that was Hoist was traveling around running networks. He was doing the stuff for the Gracie network back then. I joined the Gracie network early on in the 90s, and he would travel around, and
Hmm.
being a purple belt in the 90s, you were pretty much a guide. Nobody knew anything. And if you
Yeah.
had wrestling, I let the Duke wrestling team train with me for free. And then I was still always kept doing my Thai boxing when I opened up my own gym. In the 90s, we would do Thai striking 2 nights a week and gi jiu-jitsu. And then we'd have wrestling classes. I'd let
Hmm.
some of the coaches or the wrestlers come in and be coaches for the wrestling. But you had such a jump on everybody back then. But going back to what I was saying, the Gracie Academy, there was Kaiki was teaching there. Horion was the figurehead. He would do more privates, but not a lot of classes. Horion was the main instructor at the academy because Hoist was traveling, and Hoist would sometimes teach. But Hoist built his relationships with guys like me that ran networks, right? So, and I respected and I still respect Kaiki. I think one of my visits there, he gave me a stripe on one of my either blue or purple belt, but everything else came from Hoist. But when Kaiki had a falling out with Horion, he left and opened up his own academy. And the guys at the academy that were basically a belt higher than me and the 5 guys that got our belts under Hoist, there were yeah, pretty much there was a handful that were, maybe 3 or 4 guys that were, a rank ahead of us that lived at the academy. They left with Kaiki, and then Hoist would, was just travel around, and we kind of became somewhat of the senior guys because a lot of these guys would get close to their brown and black belts, and then they'd end up being some kind of falling out at the academy, and then they would leave. With
Hmm.
us, being networks, we never ran into any kind of issues. My loyalty is with Hoist, not just because of jujitsu, but because of the person that he is and the way he carries himself. So my relationship with him was that way, and he would come down and train with us quite a bit. So I stayed with him, and that's why. So I don't want to say, hey, I was just that good. There's guys ahead of us that started before '93 that were living at the academy that were a little bit ahead of me, but
Right.
because of just the
Right.
climate that was there, they
Yeah.
chose to leave.
And I
So
know.
I'm not trying to underplay or upplay what I'm. I just going to
Sure.
put it where.
Sure. Now I know you got very into the jujitsu and you trained very consistently in it, whereas a lot of the military guys you had come up training with, they were constantly being deployed, so they weren't able to train as regularly as you were, and you eventually became the most experienced guy in that group for jujitsu and grappling, and you were the guy the special forces soldiers started coming to train with. Is that how it went?
Pretty much. I opened the gym, and then when I got out of the school of design, I worked as a designer for several years, and I realized I didn't like sitting behind a computer all day. So my wife was a pharmacist. I met her doing my undergrad, and she ended up getting a doctorate in pharmacy, and she had gotten a job at Duke Hospital. So we didn't have a ton of money, but it was to the point where if I'm going to make a move, I need to do it before we have kids and have too much on us. So I quit and just opened up a gym, and it was more of a meathead gym. I didn't really know how to run a gym. We would, when you let the Duke wrestling team train for free, and then you had no heat and air, and guys would show up, and you were just sweating as soon as you got on the mat at certain times of the year in Durham, Hillsborough, North Carolina. So I was wondering why we didn't have a lot of. I had about 30 students, 40 students, but we would dominate MMA matches all up and down the East Coast. We would fight, but they had this thing in North Carolina called the Gladiator Law that was passed after the third UFC that was held in Charlotte. So we would go to Virginia and
Right.
Georgia, and I had a team
Right.
of guys, and it was fun. That was almost the route I was taking, is focusing more on being fighting a little bit, but coaching guys. At the same time, I was doing some work in Bragg.
Yeah. At what point did you start to develop your SOC-P program and begin to really do this through some kind of official channels for the military?
Well, I was fortunate enough to get linked up with some specialty units in Bragg, and some of them left. That was in '98. Some of them left to train the air marshals. So I went and was asked to help revamp the air marshal program. But the first, leading from '98 till 9/11, most of the training I was doing with the soldiers was more MMA, street fighting type training, not defensive tactics, DT, CQB
Hmm.
type stuff that I involved into later. When I went to work with the air marshals, I brought a better understanding of a lot of techniques that was lacking, but then there were some things that I was lacking, which was the understanding of tactical type fighting and DT and putting on cuffs, cuffing,
Hmm.
prisoner handling, detaining, use of force continuum. And, a lot of these in fighting in the spaces that we were fighting in, I'd addressed it a little bit, but not the tubular assault fighting that we do
Right.
now, which is
Well,
buses and planes.
well, I know you were while you were in the process of creating SOC-P, you were still going around and training with or bringing in a lot of top instructors to round out your own knowledge, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, that's what I was, fortunate. When I left uh, the air marshal thing came to an end. I was asked midway through, they were cutting the program back because they needed enough air marshals in the sky at a certain time. So a lot of the programs that I helped develop, which was the air marshal curriculum, they cut that, and they were going to get that when they went to their hub, which was locations spread out all the big cities where the marshals had their base, primarily flying out of. And but so they said they were going to get their training back there. They asked me and a couple other guys to become federal defensive tactics instructors when I wasn't even a federal agent. So they blessed us on, trained us, and then we stayed on and helped them at the FLETC in Artesia, New
Hmm.
Mexico. And that was right after. So 9/11 hit. At January, I was in Artesia, New Mexico for a little over a year. Then they offered me a job to take over some of the training at the Atlanta hub. I almost did that. I would have to fly for a year, but a unit in Bragg offered me a job. So I decided that was a really good gig and dream job. So I took that and then started, working with guys there. And there we were able to bring in guys from other
Right.
disciplines
Yeah, I know
to get
you've done a lot
involved.
of stuff with Greg Jackson, who's trained several UFC champions. Who are the guys you really learned a lot from or were able to bring in that you felt
Yeah.
helped?
And these guys, a lot of these guys, sign non-disclosures for some of these places, but I enjoyed working with Greg Jackson, Greg Nelson, Randy Couture came in, and then
Hmm.
Anna Santo. I mean, if there was somebody that we could justify bringing in that wasn't weird,
Hmm.
we would meaning that sometimes I would go and train with these people and they wouldn't know who I was, but if their
Right.
personality didn't seem to match up, you
Yeah.
just had to kind of vet it a little bit. Or sometimes the military, the green suiters may have somebody that they would recommend. to bring in, and we'd do the best we could before
But
we
that's a pretty good gig, getting to, your profession, you get to train with Greg Jackson, Dan Inosanto, Randy Couture. That's a pretty good gig for somebody that loves martial arts.
Oh, it's really cool because normally you would do a class with someone like that, and if I just showed up green, I would not get the attention that I get because of that position. Then it's like whatever question you ask, they're going to give you their honest opinion because one, they know you're not competing against them,
Hmm.
and they're just want to help. And that evolved me a lot really quick, and also made me a lot more well-rounded.
Yeah, that's
Um,
something I've always appreciated about you, and I think that's why we've always gotten along so well, that we share that attitude of trying to learn from every good source we can and of being open-minded, looking at this stuff objectively and not being too attached to any one style or instructor.
well, that's a lot of too. I learned even in going through the School of Design at NC State. I mean, you can nobody cares how much work you put into something or how much you like it. When you design a product in front of the classroom, there you would design it, and you could stay up for weeks building whatever it is, and everybody would attack it for its
Hmm.
weaknesses, and you could get a failing grade or a bad grade because you would hang on to something that really wasn't the answer. And if you couldn't see it and wouldn't realize it and pivot, you would fall behind. And
Yeah.
in martial arts, it can be that way too. That we have to look at objectively at everything, but we also have to be careful. Just because I have a background in doing something, it may come natural to me to do certain movements, and it may not become natural to that student. To based on time that you have to train with them, there may be a quicker, I don't say a
Yeah.
better answer, but you've got 8 hours to give this guy everything he's got, so you've got to switch it to something else.
And what you
Because
said about being well-rounded is really important too, particularly any kind of real-world fighting situations. You can't rely on any one thing or even one weapon. You have to be able to have versatility to adjust to the situation, right?
yeah, I mean, and that's to me, it's just common sense. Even in life, people do get a little bit tunnel vision on one perspective, but there's lots of ways to win the fight or solve the problem.
Absolutely. So one of the most fascinating things about what you do, at least to me, is your students regularly employ what you teach them in these real world life and death situations, and you get feedback from them, right? You kind of debrief guys when they come back from deployments and find out what situations they're facing and how your sock piece stuff worked or what didn't work, and you're continually modifying what you do based on that real world feedback, correct?
Yeah, basically, working with students that go abroad and then students that are coming back, and then, green suitors that oversee the training and input that they have from their experiences kind of guide what we do. But I think the most important thing you have to have is your finger on the pulse of really what is the fight that you're training for.
Mhm.
You want students to be somewhat well rounded with their grappling and their striking, but you cannot neglect their task specific
Yeah,
combative needs, which can be the cuffing, prisoner handling, detaining. And
right.
then you take, hey, what's the most common things that you're running into this unit, the missions you run in the country that you're in with the
Hmm.
tools and the way you're engaging the enemy? What are the ways you're ended up in a combative situation? Recreate those situations, and then that becomes part of your POI, whatever it takes to win those. And then you can take the students that are coming up next and then run them through the same scenarios that other people have ran into in the real world or afraid it's going to happen. And it's really based on how much time you have to train someone. And I try to tell people there is no perfect combative program. There's just not enough time to get everybody where they need to be. And everybody talks about all these different systems. Is this system better? And if you really look at the way students in the military train, they go through courses, right?
Hmm.
There's no set routine all the time that you do. You go through courses, you may have some train ups and a few things, but when they go through these combative courses, it has to depict what they're going to do task specific, and also realize that you're lucky if 20% of the people you train are going to do a whole lot after you're done with them.
Yeah, I
So,
know that's the key for a lot of guys is trying to get that continuous training after they leave whatever particular school, whether it's martial arts or shooting or whatever, trying to get these guys to buy in and practice on their own.
yeah. And that's where it becomes a little bit harder to where when you're working sustainment training at certain units, you're there to do whatever they want to do. If a guy wants to do scenarios all day and their team does, then you can do that. Or if a guy, most of the time guys are in the jiu-jitsu and MMA right now, so that's what you're doing. But they're all give them
Right.
attributes. Some
Yeah.
form of grappling is important because you will be in a clinch fight for your tools. If you show up to an altercation with tools and they see it, and if they have a tool, you're going to be in a shootout.
Yeah.
If they don't have a tool and you get close enough, then you're in a hand-to-hand
Right.
situation.
And because you're largely dealing with soldiers who are engaged in combat, you're not teaching necessarily hand-to-hand methods as a primary thing for them to rely on. You're teaching people to use their empty hand techniques or even knife techniques often just as a method of gaining time or space to access their primary weapon, which for these guys would be a rifle or occasionally a pistol, right?
Primarily, yeah, and if they clear past long gun range, and then that's your hand to hand, you will do based on your use of force in the moment.
Hmm.
So, what would determine for a soldier that's say doing an assault on a room, the environment will dictate his use of force, the
Yeah.
weapons that that person has, how dangerous, how undermanned are you, and how many of them
Yeah.
are there when you're having to deal with it. All these things are going to come into play. So you will cover empty hand techniques in conjunction with edge weapon. And if you're going to the edge
Yeah.
weapon, you're using that to primarily get back to a larger force multiplier,
Yeah.
which will probably be your handgun or long
Yeah,
gun.
I think you gave me the example once of a soldier who you trained who was being forced face first into a wall by an enemy combatant, and his rifle was pinned between him and the wall. So he pulled out his knife, not to kill the guy, but just to push back against his attacker with the tip of the knife to create enough space so he could then turn and shoot him, right?
And that's the preferred thing. I think sometimes with the edge weapon techniques that are taught, they can get a little too dynamic. If you have a handgun, don't stop until you get that handgun out because it's not about you and him. It's about you, him, and his buddy that may be coming at you with a
Hmm.
machete or the dead space in the room or the environment that you're not
Yeah.
picking up that somebody's going to engage you from across the room. So once it's on, it's on. And you either get compliance, and if the environment dictates, then the use of force may shoot up drastically. So you have to work inside of that. But you try to train people not to just run around and stab and shoot
Yeah.
everybody if you don't have to.
I,
You
I
have
know
to
you
get a lot
developed
of
your own
fundamentals.
combat knife for those kind of situations in mind, didn't you? You call it the sock P dagger, is that right?
The side P dagger was
Yeah.
based on I would have guys show up in the training, whatever knife you want to carry, have a trainer. And then, I remember one of the guys smarter than me, more athletic than me. He was getting tackled in the scenario, and he used his knife as we told him to do. And this is what we learned even with the air marshals because we were training them with spider toes and they had SIGs. But you couldn't get the folder out really most of the time in the
Hmm.
fight with the trainer
Hmm.
inside of the tubular fighting that we were doing on the planes. So when these guys would get tackled with 40 pounds of kit on and a rifle strapped to you and a helmet on, and with a room full of furniture, it's a different deal. You're not going to be able to move the way you want to.
Yeah.
So if you have an edge weapon to create a little bit of space to allow your legs to move, or if he
Yeah.
grabs for your handgun, you're not using your long gun. You're not going to have all the techniques that people show in the mat room, and you got all this open space that can work, right? And
Mhm.
depending on who grabbed you, that you can make it work, depending on your ability. But good luck in a room full of furniture, 40, 50 pounds of kit and a rifle slap to you to
Yeah.
free that in the amount of time that you're going to have. And even me in my prime, I would do pretty well. But you would say, hey, all right, Greg, you get tackled over this equipment and you're a black belt. So yeah, if I could get up in 10 seconds, 15 seconds, you would say, well, that's quick. But in
Yeah.
a gunfight, that's eternity. They're won
And
and lost in nanoseconds. You're shot or stabbed by somebody else in the room before you know it. So you have to win those scrambles as soon as you lose them. Understand the environment around you, get to this tool that you can get to with
Hmm.
either hand. The dagger is designed to fit in the center of
Yeah.
your chest. Pin your handgun down, scoop it out, and then
Yeah.
I like it in the dagger manner. It's a skeletonized handle with a ring. So when I do an inside outside collar tie up, I say touch the tonsil, stir the pot, use the steel to
Yeah.
get to the lead. I'll fish in what we call gaffing, gaff the elbow. He starts to move away, hook his elbow and turn him so he doesn't re-grab you.
Hmm.
Just because somebody's stabbed, they may back up and then relaunch on you. You got to turn them so then you can successfully get your firearm out. And if it's a handgun, make sure it cycles so you
Yeah,
don't,
I know
you're
you've
not.
got a few versions of that. They all look very handy. I think it's commercially available from Benchmade Knives, right? If anybody
Or you
wants
can
to
go to
check those out.
Benchmade Knives, you go to socpgear.com.
Hmm.
And that's a website I have now for a lot of my equipment,
Yeah,
socpgear.com.
right.
Uh, and that way you can get it there probably
Yep,
because they keep selling out at Benchmade right now. So you have to go to other locations. They're not
right.
keeping up right
Yeah,
now with
I would
demand.
definitely recommend people check those out. Now, I know it's your opinion, and some other very good people who specialize in this sort of practical military and even law enforcement training share this belief with you that most serious, extreme close quarter combat encounters eventually devolve into a fight over a weapon, whether that's a firearm or a knife. One of us is trying to draw his weapon or effectively use his weapon at very close range, and the other person is trying to stop him and maybe draw his own weapon. That's, in your experience, how most very serious hand-to-hand combat situations usually go.
Yeah, I mean, if they, you got to think about it realistically, right? If we're fighting to kill each other and you want to survive, whatever. If you have a firearm, as soon as you see me, you're going to use that firearm, right?
Mhm.
Or you're going to deploy it. So you either have to have a knife or you got caught and you didn't have a tool on you, and I'm going to get to my tools, so you're going to try to stop me and get to my tools. And if you take an opportunity to do other stuff, could you hit them with a perfect right cross and lay somebody out? Yes. But people have helmets on. It's hard to do that. Or most people aren't taking that chance and the environment that you're in. So for us, a lot of it becomes to, retain and be able to retain and transition to your force multipliers at all these whatever position you end up in. But once somebody gets past rifle range and it latches on to your handgun, if you're running with a handgun, you've got to have something with your support hand that you can get to inside of the fight. And you've got to be able to retain it. And then, be able to clear malfunctions. You got to be able to do a lot of stuff with that. That's why, I designed the dagger over 15
Yeah.
years ago,
So you
and
could
it's
grip
so
it with one hand, but still use that hand to manipulate things, right?
you can, that same hand, you can have a steady shooting platform, or you can draw your handgun with that, and you can clear malfunctions,
Yeah.
change magazines, because there's a good chance you will have a malfunction at that close
Yeah.
range.
Yeah.
And a lot of it becomes, 60% of your training is deploying it in the fight, maintaining good grip, and knowing where you want to put the steel. And you're being reactive. If you knew you were going to need to get to it, you would have shot him from across the room. So all these things are working from an ambush inside of your lizard brain, trying to figure out what you need to do. And if you'd known you'd been there, you'd been somewhere else, and probably that guy would have done the same. If you're on the street, it can be different. That's where your majority of on knife assaults are
Right.
ambushes. They're not, hey, you've got a knife and we're going to duel. It can
Yeah.
happen. You can
Hmm.
get stabbed and back up and pull your knife, and that person may decide to stay there with you. But statistically, you're surviving. They're mugging, and you're trying to get to your tool inside of that fight.
Well, that's
Um,
that's why there's no one size fits all technique you can always rely on. And I know, like me, you believe in modifying techniques for these specific scenarios. And when you mentioned the your work with the Federal Air Marshals, I think that you started really doing that. Was that after 9/11 they brought you in? Because
yeah, right
I,
after
I,
right
I
after 9/11 hit, and then that January I was there.
Yeah, I remember you telling me they wanted you to help update their hand-to-hand combat program, and you had never fought inside an airplane, so they gave you access to a grounded commercial plane that was
Well,
empty for a week.
well,
You spent like a weekend sparring with
what
people in
happened?
there trying to
Yeah,
figure out what works.
I didn't feel comfortable with what some of it was. I questioned it to the contractors that were there, that were over it, knew I knew enough about what I was talking about. So me and it was another purple belt, I think at the time, a collegiate wrestler. We would meet in the morning time because in Artesia, in that time of the year, you're talking about February, March. By that time, January, a little bit of January,
Mhm.
it was so hot you'd have to get in there in the morning time or you'd just cook. So we
Mhm.
could fight for a couple hours and then they would just be so dehydrated and sweaty. And we did it for a couple of days. But we developed some TTPs for fighting around the seats and just trying to figure it out. But with that said, though, we didn't have a people in there, but we still had the baseline of knowing what would work and what wouldn't work.
Yeah, I don't think
And
people pay enough attention to that, that you may be fighting in very different circumstance and just being in the gym on mats or in a ring or a cage. The real world doesn't go like that. And that's a perfect example. You're in an airplane with these tight quarters, the seats all around you, and people don't train for that kind of thing normally. So their martial art may not translate too well to that, right?
no, you need to do it. I mean, that's why I designed what's called the combat cube. It's 2 feet by 4 feet by a foot and a half, giant heavy block
Hmm.
that velcros together. And I designed those back in 2010 for us to train and fight over. It's probably the most valuable piece of equipment I have inside the SOCP program outside of the dagger.
Those are your combat cubes. Is that what you're calling them?
Combat cubes, yeah. And
Yeah.
that will is a safe way because there were padded furniture that we would use back in the early 2000s, but they were so soft if you fall on them they would just almost disappear, and they almost became a hazard. It was dangerous to really tackle people over some of the that stuff because it wasn't rigid enough for you to get a real feel for what's going on. And I can take these cubes and lay them out in the mat rooms and then carry them to the shoot house and build opposing threats to go over some basic CQB movements, and then dealing with people inside of the actual mat room that translates to the shoot house quicker. So you're not wasting time on your integration of
Yeah.
combatives in that environment. And then another thing is I designed what's called your AR pads. So they're pads that go over your training plastic rifle, right? How many people say they do real world combatives? Well, everybody does. But guess what? In combat, you're going to have a rifle strapped to you, more than likely a 2 point sling strapped around you, and you do not want to lay your rifle down. Now, you may in certain situations, but majority of the fighting, you will probably have that rifle strapped to you, and it sucks. But people neglect that. It's hard to train that way. It's not fun. But if you just had a plastic rifle that was hard plastic, you'd put holes in your mats. Your teeth would get knocked out because as soon as you got tackled, the stock would fly up and the right above where your grip is would smack you in the mouth and you'd poke holes in people. So I designed, quickly realized we need pads on these rifles and designed that. And I'm the only person selling these pads that go over rifles, but it's a baseline for all combatives.
Hmm.
The every branch of the military, from the Army Combative Program, the McMap, and the Air Force Combative Program, they all specialty units that are really do combatives, they all buy these pads from me
Yeah, it makes
for
sense.
that
You
reason.
don't want to be taking that hard plastic thing right in the face. That's no good.
Yeah.
I know you'd mentioned doing scenario training inside the shoot houses at Fort Bragg, where you set up all these different scenarios that the soldiers might have to face. And yeah, you've shared some of the video footage of that training with me. One of the things I liked most about it was you make a lot of these scenarios more realistic by doing sort of shoot, no shoot choices in them where the situation is a little unclear and the subject doesn't know if he should use force, or if he does use force, just how much he should use.
You have to do that. You don't want a guy just shooting up everything. You don't want to shoot someone that doesn't deserve it. And the mentality of just shooting everybody is not the answer. You
Yeah.
want to be able to dial it up and dial it down so we can run these guys into these scenarios where we amp them up and amp them back down, and we do I have dozens of scenarios. Some are plain clothes meeting on bad type, some are CQB, some are fighting in and around vehicles, some are what we call even our hooded micro scenarios
Hmm.
where the hood comes up and it creates, you want to create stressful stuff one after the other. So their ability to think is clear is diminished. So then you can really get down to the lizard brain, what I call the lizard brain processing, to where now you're having to think from there. And that's where some of the growth comes. Teaching people to fight is kind of the easy part. It's training them to make good judgment decisions under stress is the hardest. And you really don't know if a guy's how he's going to react. He may be the best fighter, he may be the best shooter, but it doesn't mean he's the right guy. You've got to train him in these scenarios, put him in the task that he's going to face, and let and see how he makes judgment decisions moment to moment. And you can get people there, but sometimes you just don't can't get them there in the amount of
Right.
time they're students.
Yeah, I
Um,
know it's interesting from what you've shared of that with me. Some of the guys who are not as skilled hand-to-hand combatants, they sometimes tend to go to their firearms too quickly when the situation doesn't warrant it. And on the flip side of that, the guys who are very skilled fighters, hand-to-hand fighters, they may stay with the hand-to-hand a little bit too long and not go to their firearm quick enough because they think they can
Yeah.
handle it with their
And that's where the
hand-to-hand.
scenarios help them dial in as an individual. Each
Mhm.
individual kind of carry their own thought process with them in there. And based on the rules of engagement for that unit and the mission that they may be on, scenarios are really good for them to do that. So they know they can formulate a line in the sand based on the way you're fighting the war now. When I mean line in the sand is knowing when you're going to engage that threat with lethal force. And in doing that, you will, by the training that we do with the special operations units that way, it leads to less post traumatic stress
Yeah.
because they don't second guess what they did. Why?
Yeah.
Because before they got there, we ran scenarios and said, this is when you should, for the safety of everybody around you and your own, you need to engage the threat right now this way for this reason. And you don't, and then other kids, they go over there and they get in a situation, they start to second guess
Hmm.
what they should have done, or maybe they did it too soon because they didn't have the training to make the decision of when to do it and leave the issues there and carry it back
Yeah.
with them. So by running these stressful scenarios, they'll make better decisions and there'll be less post traumatic stress later because of it.
Yeah, you had mentioned being able to go in de up and down the lethality scale, going from talking to sudden severe violence to quickly modulating level of violence to something non-lethal. How do you teach people to navigate that and be able to recognize quickly the appropriate amount of force they should use?
Well, for obviously first we all discuss it to say this is the way to do it, but then you got to put them in that stressful environment and then make them do it under stress. But you've got to get them, so amped up to where they're not quite thinking 100% clear.
Mhm.
Like when I use the term lizard brain,
Mhm.
they're just falling in that reactive mode. And sometimes once people engages one threat that they need to shoot and another one pops up, it's just your brain doesn't make that switch as quick to not shoot. It's a lot easier to shoot somebody when another threat's popping right back at you. And it's easier for me to armchair quarterback guys. I set up these jack in the box situations where I can pretty much force anybody to shoot somebody or probably go to jail if you stimulate them enough and long enough, and especially if you go a little bit without sleep
Mhm.
and make them lose a bunch of scenarios because they didn't react quick enough. You can do that and they start hanging out there, then they'll do better. But it's an individual thing. And are they comfortable? Can they get comfortable in that environment? And then also the audio or the visual exclusion that they can get under that kind of stress where they miss other stuff going on around them, just see this narrow spot. And can you open up that aperture of what they see by the experiences and comfort that they have?
Do you, do you think that's something that martial arts schools, gyms in general that are interested in any kind of practical self-defense need to do more some type of practical scenario trainings, whether it's in a room with furniture or out in a parking lot, and having choices where do I get into a fight? Do I draw a weapon? Do I run away? Do I try to talk? Do
Well,
you think?
all these things are important. Whatever scenario you think you're going to run into, is it to be a better barroom fighter? Is it getting, kidnapped? Is it getting robbed? Is it your house breaking into?
Mhm.
run through it at least with some other people, or run through it in educational, in a thought out way, logical way in your head. Understand the before, the during, and the after. Understand the rules of engagement for the city, the county, the state, and the country that you're in. And then it may say, okay, I can justify, I can't justify. And then you figure out, is an immediate threat, right? Is this
Mhm.
immediate threat on your life or someone else's life? And you can kind of justify it and go through that in your head. You can start with it in your head, but until you physically do it and feel stress, you don't always make the best decisions. No, knowing's not enough. You've got to run through the stuff. And I can sit there and say I would do this or whatever, but until you're actually there doing it
Yeah.
under that stress, you don't know.
Stress changes everything. Anybody who has ever gone into a boxing ring or an MMA cage for the first time to spar or compete understands that when somebody's
And and
actually trying to hurt you,
yeah, and that's
things
what I like
change.
about some of the competitions. So when go and compete whatever you want: judo, wrestling, boxing, jujitsu, gi, no time limit. It's you and somebody else, and you'll learn to react. And that'll be a slice of the actual overall combative pie. That's a
Mhm.
slice of it. The rest of it is put yourself in the environment that you're in, learn how to use other force multipliers around you, learn how to deal with multiple threats in the environment that you might be in, or have a tactical plan for that. And then see, and you can know all there is to think that and you can still, it just won't be your day.
Yeah.
And it just unfolds that way.
So if people want to find out more about you, about SOCP, maybe buy your book H to H Combat or some of the neat products you've come up with, like the combat cubes, what's a good way for them to find out
The
about you?
equipment is SOCP gear .com,
Mhm.
special operations combative program, SOCPgear.com. And then the training for law enforcement military is SOCP.info. I run an MMA gym still to this day, but I don't really teach civilians what I teach the military.
Mhm.
I'm just, not that I never will. I would do some edge weapon courses for
Mhm.
defense to get to a handgun type stuff, but I'm like, even right now it's
Yeah.
early February and I'm booked up till July, and then I've got so many other I've got over half a dozen guys that work for me full
Yeah.
time with clearances that are all black belts, former pro fighters and
Mhm.
soldiers, that I'm managing so much stuff. It's
Well,
hard to
I
take
would
time.
definitely recommend people go check out your site and follow what you're doing because you do some of the most cutting edge techniques, tactics within the martial arts world right now. So I always
And
recommend
the
people
H to
check
H
out.
book, I wrote that 20 years ago in '04, but still some of the techniques are somewhat relevant, but we have evolved quite a bit. But it's a good sustainment training, piece. And then and I'm on this thing called social media now, and
I've heard of that.
it is this new thing. It's been out for just a little bit. It's SOCP_solutions, SOCP_solutions. So I'll show some equipment there. I really don't show a whole lot of
Is
techniques.
that on what on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, or
It,
Facebook, or where you can people
it's
find you?
Instagram. Yeah, that
Instagram.
platform,
Okay.
Instagram. Yeah. But that's
I
about the only platform I'm kind of. And one of my instructors kept getting on to me about it, so he stood it up for me. So I've been kind of trying to throw stuff on there. Mainly, it's because of the products that I sell. I've got bags with Vertex, so I've got fanny packs with concealment compartments for pistols and knives, and then a sling pack, and then
well,
I've got another bag I'm working on now.
I will put a link down to your site in the show notes. Anybody that wants to can go check that out. I highly recommend it. And I really want to thank you for coming on, Greg. I know you're always super busy, so I really do appreciate you taking the time today.
No, I've enjoyed talking with you, Mark. We've been friends for quite some time. Even when you did some articles for me in Black Belt Magazine, was it, I don't know how long, 20
A
years? I
long
don't know.
time. Yeah, it's
That
been a
was
while.
It's been a while, So that was when these had these things called magazines,
Yeah.
and it was made out of paper.
Paper.
This stuff called paper.
Do they still have paper?
I don't know. I
Uh,
think so, but I don't know. I think it's made from a tree. I
do
was
they still
told.
have trees? I don't
Yeah,
know, man.
that's
All right. Hey, thank you again for taking the time. I really
no. I
appreciate it,
enjoyed
Greg.
it. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Maury.
Okay. Thanks again to Greg for being on the show. You can find a link to his site down below in the show notes, as well as a link to my own website and to the site of Eleanor Academia, who kindly provides the music for the show. Just to remind everyone one more time, if you enjoyed the show and can hit the subscribe button, that's much appreciated. Until next time, as an old sensei of mine used to say, keep punching.